Hello everyone, welcome to a Crackenfold live stream. You know me, I'm John F. White with my cup of tea, but I have with me someone more special than a cup of tea, my good friend, Dr. Jon Norman-Mason. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, John. Lovely to be here.
Tell people who you are, what you do, and why you're a doctor.
I'm a doctor because I signed up to work really hard and it was a bit of a grind, but yes, so I'm a storyteller who is particularly interested in myth and legend from Northern Europe, and associating that with the actual landscape and the history, the context that it arises from. So in that respect, I guess I'm kind of a folklorist as well. Academically, that's one of the ways I define myself. Folklorist and cultural historian. And out of all that practice and out of just asking questions about all that, then I have done a PhD looking specifically at how stories, not just from old historical folklore, but just the ongoing process of imagination really helps people relate to the landscape around them.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so today we are talking all things Mabinogion, or maybe all things Mabinogi. So I guess we'll jump straight in to try and find out what it is, and then we're going to the story and work out what's going on. So the first question I have really is, well, what is the Mabinogion, and why? Well, what does the title mean, and why is it connected with Mabinogi? What is all this about?
What's it all about? Absolutely, yeah. It's such a wonderful word if you're not familiar with it as well, isn't it? So it really drives you to go what. So yeah, the Mabinogion, as they are called nowadays, is a selection of 11 stories found in medieval manuscripts from Wales, written in Middle Welsh, but which draw on, some of them at least, as we shall discuss, draw on much older traditions, much older material, much older beliefs as well. And so one of the questions which I know we'll be talking about is, to what extent does this reflect pre-Christian mythology from the British Isles? And I first came across the Mabinogion, at the age of about 11, and have been utterly beguiled by them ever since, and that's one of the things that led me to specialize in the sort of research areas that I do, really. The name itself is a bit of a red herring in some ways. As I say, that's what the Mabinogion is, what we call it these days. That isn't to say that it would have been known under that title back when it was first compiled. Within the Mabinogion, as I say, it's 11 stories, and within that there is a subset, if you like, of 4 stories which are interlinked, interrelated, and they are clearly conceived as a single unit, and each one finishes with the formula, that is how this branch of the Mabinogi ends. And in fact, in one of the 2 manuscripts, we'll talk about the manuscript sources and things later, I'm sure, but one of the 2 manuscripts that we know these stories actually begins those 4 tales with, this is the beginning of a Mabinogi as well. So we have there this idea of a Mabinogi as a thing, and these 4 stories together make up a Mabinogi. Or presumably that it was just the 4 branches. There could have been 5 or 6 that never survived. But in 2 different manuscript sources, we have the same set of 4, then followed by several other unrelated stories. So there we have that. And if you're not sure what a Mabinogi is, well, this is something that, again, has exercised a lot of discussion over the years by scholars as well. It's believed to be related to the word mabon, meaning son, as in a child, the son.
Okay.
And so extrapolating from that, a young boy, perhaps. And so absolutely, yeah.
Because of Eddas, meaning like grandmother.
Right, yeah.
This family connection with stories in a way.
Yeah, it's seeing traditions and stories as being this sort of individuals almost with a family heritage themselves. It's a lovely idea, you're right. Some people have suggested over the years that maybe the Mabinogi was meant as a sort of material for practicing for young apprentice bards who might have been known as Mabinogi themselves, singular Mabinog, plural Mabinogi. But another theory, which was particularly pushed by Eric Hamp. Yes, I am getting his name right. I was going to say Hemp, but no, that would be poorly. Eric Hamp, who was a linguist and a really groundbreaking scholar of these things, that he suggested that it might be something to do with a figure called Mabon, who appears not in the Four Branches, but in one of the other stories, who may or may not be a divine figure, who again we'll talk about, and that maybe the whole original story began with a cycle of tales all about one single divine figure, but that it changed over time. And W.J. Griffith was a scholar in the first half of the 20th century who likewise suggested that the Four Branches, at least as they're known, were originally all about one particular character who you could see as analogous with this divine figure, Mabon. But actually, these are all the theories, and this just goes to show just how much discussion you can get because there's so much mystery still involved. Actually, there are other texts from manuscripts of a similar age from the medieval period, also using the word Mabinogi to talk about other things. And a really good example of this, which I think says a lot for the discussion, is that there is even a bit of biblical text that summarizes the early years of Jesus's life, and it is called Mabinogi Jesu Christ, or the Mabinogi of Jesus Christ. And so on that basis, what's that? Sorry?
Suggesting boy in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's something about somebody when they were a boy. So some scholars have suggested that actually what we should really interpret the name as is the childhood deeds, the boyhood adventures, or that sort of thing. And given the Jesu Christ example, I feel that is more likely to be the case. And it's also again then been suggested that maybe that was its original meaning, and then over time that just came to mean story, adventure, and became a more general thing. So that's where the name comes from. That's Mabinogi. Mabinogion is actually a scribal error that appears only once in the entire manuscript tradition of these stories, where at the end of one particular story, instead of saying this is how this branch of the Mabinogi ends, some medieval scribe has written Mabinogion instead, which is an easy mistake in some ways because in Welsh, Mabinogi is a plural, but often plurals end in ion as well. That would be another way of giving a plural, and so it's a mistake. But it entered into modern usage with a guy called William Owen Pugh, who was the first person to translate part of all this corpus into English in 1795, and he called it the Mabinogion. And then the lady Charlotte Guest, who was the first person to translate the whole thing, she picked that up and used that consistently throughout. That's how this branch of the Mabinogion, for example, or and published the whole thing as the Mabinogion. And so it's a modern name, but it's a very useful name for us to use because scholars and audiences alike know what's meant by it, and we can talk about this collection of 11 tales with some consistency. That's
interesting. Okay, so the translation is what I was going to ask about next. So most English people or English reading people will find a translation of the Mabinogion rather than look at the original language. So who, I was going to say who first brought them to English, but you've mentioned Charlotte Guest as the final one. But was there influence in how she imagined them? So for people not familiar in the history of folklore, the antiquarians, as we often call them, the people before academia proper, had some unique methods and biases towards translating, especially if it's quite nationalistic. And I'm sure there may have been some Welsh nationalism floating about. So, what is the best translation? Who mainly did it, and are there influences in there that are can be seen today, like nationalism or antiquarianism or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Charlotte Guest herself is a really interesting character in this respect. So she lived from 1812 to 1895, so sort of spanning most of the Victorian times, just preceding Victoria's reign and on through the 19th century. She was from landed gentry, but not in Wales, actually from Lincolnshire in England. So she wasn't Welsh herself, but at a very young age, then she married John Josiah Guest, who was, among other things, the master of an iron foundry in South Wales. So when she came there, then she developed this interest in Welsh literature, because it seems that she was already really interested in old literature of all kinds, to a very academically able extent. So as well as having studied Latin, Greek, French, and Italian in her youth, she taught herself how to read Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew as well.
In those days, that's incredible. Yes.
Yeah, I know. And so she's soaking up all this stuff. She's just clearly just had an interest in this stuff. And when she arrived in Wales, as well as taking an interest in the welfare of her husband's workers, and in the context of the 1830s and 40s and Chartism and radical politics, the beginnings of the trade union movement and things, then she was saying we ought to do more to provide for the welfare of these people. And so she did a lot to set up education schemes and leisure activities and things for the workers in the ironworks. After her husband's death in the 1850s, then she actually became co-manager of the ironworks. Alongside all of this, she had 10 children as well. But she just began translating Welsh poetry and taking
10 children in an army.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and when you're running a business and everything. Yeah. She was involved in associations of Welsh literary scholars at the time, and it was quite a welcome part, it seems like, for of their circle. And so she began by translating bits of Welsh poetry from medieval manuscripts again, and then between 1838 and 1845, then she published this several volume set of these stories that appear in 2 Welsh manuscripts from sort of late medieval times, although, like I say, the stories are probably a lot older. Which she titled the Mabinogion. The way she went about it, you can definitely see the voice of the time there. It's full of "forsooth, thou mayst not" kind of language, and so from a 21st century readership, it's not the most accessible translation, I would say. Although there is a very nice edition with illustrations by Alan Lee, who's known by many people for his work on Tolkien's corpus.
I mean, that is a good point, actually. What translations are there? I mean, if someone wanted a literal translation or a performance one, would you have recommendations?
Yeah, I do have a recommendation, very definitely. It's a very recent one. I think probably the most recent one on general release, and that is Sioned Davies' 2007 edition, which is in the Oxford World Classics line. I think one of its major advantages over the original Charlotte Guest one is that it's incredibly pithy and readable, and you can get right into it in terms of the language that's being used. There have been other English translations in between as well. There was the Gwyn Jones one from the early to mid 20th century was the go-to for a long time. And there have been translations into modern Welsh from the Middle Welsh as well, which were very well thought of. I like this one, I think, because Sioned Davies' approach was very much to try and foreground the fact that most of this material, if not all of it, would have been originally alive and known from oral tradition. It wouldn't have been written texts. It would have been spoken stuff, and more than just spoken stuff, it would have been stuff to be performed. the medieval context that the Mabinogion seems to have come from is quite an upper class context. It is stuff that would have been tradition and entertainment for lords and ladies in their medieval halls, and so the Shona Davies' argument is that the tales themselves were spoken before they were written, and they were spoken by professional poets, storytellers, performing to an upper class audience. And there are ways in which you can sort of see that in the text, like when it gets really, really dramatic and exciting, then it tends to slip from past tense into present tense. So it's no longer he did this, she did that. It's and they're doing this, and they're running, and the boar is chasing and stuff, and so she keeps to that in the way that she translates it, and all the way through, really, she's just trying to imagine this as something that is intended to be spoken aloud, and it brings a real kind of concision and life to the
performance.
Yeah, exactly. So I really recommend that.
Okay,
it's got some pretty good notes as well.
Okay, so the next question, because you've touched on this, is how old is it? So there's many 11 poems. Can we sort of date a range?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I should say, I mean, although there is sort of poetry from the era, actually, it's all prose in the Mabinogion. There are references in poems of a similar era that sort of show us an awareness of the same stories. But yeah, in terms of the age, so the text as we have it is known from two particular manuscripts. That's the word I'm searching for. Sorry. One is called the White Book of Rhydderch, and that has been dated to around about 1350. And the other is called the Red Book of Hergest, and that is a little bit later, sort of 1380-ish to maybe, I've seen it said specifically 1382 until around about 1410. So very much sort of high medieval times. The White Book of Rhydderch is currently in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. The Red Book of Hergest is in Oxford, and it is believed that it is J.R.R. Tolkien's acquaintance with the Red Book of Hergest gave him the idea for the Red Book of Westmarch, which is what Bilbo's manuscript and Frodo's additions to it are supposed to be contained within, in the sort of pseudo history behind the Lord of the Rings, which is quite fun. So yeah, we're looking at around about 1350 to 1410. Really, is when the texts as we have them come from. The stories themselves are certainly older. Now, there are so many really incredible scholars of ancient manuscripts and medieval languages have gone back and forth over this, exactly when we're talking about so long. There's a really good article by Andrew Breeze that summarizes all of the different attempts to date it. I think it's just called something like The Date of the Mabinogion, and gives his point of view as well in there. But you know, aside from that, it's a really good sort of overview. The general consensus at the moment on the most reliable evidence is that the four branches themselves were probably first committed to the wording that they are now in, whether that was in a written form or still in a spoken form that was just memorized and repeated verbatim, around about the 1120s, 1130s. So reasonably late. There is one story called How Kilhuch won Olwen, which is one of the other tales in the 11, which is believed on the basis of the language that's used in it to be older, to be late 1000s, probably 1090s, although some people put it back as far as the 1060s, but most people seem to sort of hover around the 1090s. And then the remaining stories are definitely later, and we know that they're later because they show a lot of influence from the work of a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who some of our audience might be familiar with, who was a monk working at Oxford, but probably of South Walian heritage, who basically gave us the legend of King Arthur as we now know it, and had a huge influence on the literature of the time. And some of the so the later stories in the set of 11 include some stories about King Arthur's knights that in some ways are kind of Welsh versions of later French romances. Other ones are bits of Welsh traditional history to do with Max Senoledig, who was based on a Roman governor called Magnus Maximus, and older mythological stuff about a king called Llŷdd. But these stories were also picked up and used by Geoffrey of Monmouth in his work, and what we have here seems to be a kind of a Welsh response to that, to an extent at least. And so yeah, Geoffrey of Monmouth's work was published in the 1130s and onwards, and so by that token we can see that 6 of the 11 stories must have come after him. One of them, Culhwch an Olwen, which actually does involve King Arthur as well, but a very different version of King Arthur, a much more the Welsh tradition of King Arthur, uninfluenced from outside. That one is the earliest. That's from probably the 1090s. And the 4 branches, which are sort of the core, the heart of what brings a lot of people to it, certainly me. Yes, they look like they were probably first compiled in the 1120s, 1130s, independently of Geoffrey of Monmouth's work. But even then, they definitely do work with traditions which had presumably been around in oral culture for a very long time. And I know this is one of the questions people will have is it true that some of the characters in it might have been pre-Christian gods? And my answer to that would be yes, some of them, but not all of them. And the way I think it's really important to look at it is whoever compiled the Mabinogion, as it currently stands, the 4 branches at least, the 4 branches do seem to have been composed by a single author, so to speak, or compiler, a single voice is there. And I think the way we should look at it is much like modern creators who are inspired by old myths and traditions and who come up with something slightly new that references that, but puts a spin on it, which it makes it more relatable and relevant to the modern situation that we're in, and maybe slightly plays fast and loose with the order of events and the relationships between the characters and makes up a few things, but comes up with something that speaks to its time. That's what was being done with the mythological traditions present in the 4 branches of the Mabinogion. They are there and they are fascinating, but they are also being played with and reimagined in a way which gives us some wonderful glimpses into medieval Welsh courtly culture and the particular moral messages, not moralizing, but the sort of questions about human behavior, which whoever wrote it or whoever composed it wanted to bring to the fore. And in doing so, they brought to the fore some beautiful reflections on the human condition, which none of them are didactic either. It's all just you see the characters acting and you are left to draw your conclusions. And it's done in such a simple, slightly blunt at times, but just really powerful way. I think it's wonderful.
So there are lots of characters in the Mabinogion, lots and lots. So Rhiannon is famous, but you can talk about Bran and Mabon and Math and Lu and that. And you say some of them are gods, or could be gods. But do you know which ones could have been gods? Or were any sort of heroes or literary characters that were in other stories or from older material? And another question someone just asked is, can we see any differences between the Welsh King Arthur and the Geoffrey of Monmouth popularised King Arthur? I guess
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, huge differences there. Yeah, so I'll come to the Arthur question second, but yeah, in terms like the characters in the Mabinogion, the 4 branches specifically. Anyway, it's long been accepted that certain ones are like vestiges of God. So you mentioned Rhiannon before, who is a woman associated with horses, associated with motherhood and good governance of the kingdom of the land. And she comes from the other world to bring the benefits of her wisdom and of a marriage with her to a mortal ruler. And yeah, I think it was W.J. Griffith again who first suggested that she would have been a god, and people have kind of backformed from the name Rhiannon the idea that there could have been a name in the Iron Age which would have been Regantana, which would have meant great queen. And there's so many parallels between her and attested divine figures in Gaulish religion, from where we have carvings with Roman inscriptions and things, like Epona, who was a horse goddess with some association with kind of a divine mother figure and sovereignty and the like. So there's her. There is Llay, who is the hero of the fourth branch, Llay Llawgyffes, the fair one with the swift sure hand, who is often seen as a parallel with the Irish Lugh, Lugh Laubfada, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah, of the long arm. And they are both believed to be solar heroes. Again, so there's the possibility of some sort of sun god. Llay is very much associated with eagles and oak trees, both of which are said to have solar symbolism in a lot of Romano-Celtic artwork. And then on the Gaulish side, again, we have Lugh as a comparator for both of them. And Llay is connected to a collection of characters called the House of Dawn in the Mabinogion. Dawn is seen by some, although not all, as being comparable with the Irish Danu, who is the sort of mother figure behind the divine race, the gods, the Tuatha De Danann. And her house, her offspring, includes a figure called Govannon, who is a smith, and in Irish mythology, there's a smith god called Givnu, and again Gobanios in Gaulish stuff, who is a smith there as well. So we've got lots of connections there that you can see. Yeah, we can see these people connecting to gods. Cleve, who I mentioned earlier, probably similar to Irish Nuda and Romano-British Nodens as well.
And
Sorry,
the King Arthur, the Welsh King Arthur.
Yeah. Yeah, he is very different again. The King Arthur that we know, with all the sort of courtly trappings of romance, ladies with pointy hats and knights in plate armor and everything like that. That was writers in the high medieval times telling a story that was relevant to their own times and making it set in a context that looked like their own times, in some ways because ideas of history have changed. And although they knew that he was supposed to have existed in the past, there wasn't so much of a popular sense of the past being different to how it is now, and so they would still draw him as looking exactly like people from their own time, for example. The Arthur that you get in Culhwch Olwen, well, for a start, he doesn't live in Camelot. He lives in a place called Cellywig in Cornwall. He doesn't have a sword called Excalibur. It's called Caledvulch. Several of the famous knights of the Round Table, like Lancelot and Gawain and so on, they're not there. There is a Kai, who is seen as a sort of prototype for Sir Kay. There's a Bedwyr, who's Sir Bedivere. That's about it. His wife is called Gwenhwyvar, not Guinevere, and yes, there's the situation in which he rules is, on the one hand, much more like a hero of an older time, really, in a sort of a feast hall, and he is surrounded by, again, divine figures. Gwyn ap Nudd, Gwyn the son of Nudd, who's supposed to be the huntsman ruler of the other world, and he fights with giants and witches, and does extraordinary things with has a knife that he throws and cuts a witch in half, and all sorts of things. So it's proper fantastical, magical adventure type stuff, much more similar, in fact, in many ways, to some of the early medieval Irish tales of heroic kings and their magical adventures than any of the later medieval stuff, certainly.
Okay, so if someone wanted to read about the Welsh King Arthur, are there books about that?
Yeah, but there are. I mean, there's quite a good one called The Arthur of the Welsh, edited by Rachel Bromwich, AOH Jarman, and Brynley Roberts, which is an academic one, but it will give you a very good sort of distilled kind of look at some of the scholarship going on in there. I just saw in the contents as well, there's a chapter that in there on the Merlin of Welsh legend, who is very different from the Merlin of later Arthurian romance as well. In fact, was a completely separate character that Geoffrey of Monmouth kind of spliced in, but that is a completely different story. Geoffrey Ashe was a scholar of Arthurian literature who wrote a lot of books which are much more accessible, I think. I mean, that's good scholarship. But if you want a digestible way in, then look for something by Geoffrey Ashe, I think would be a good way of looking at it.
Okay, so
no, I was just going to say, I've seen in the chat there's lots of stuff going on. But somebody had specifically mentioned a character from the Mabinogion called Blodeuwedd and her potential divinity or not. I know that was a question that had been asked of you in advance. Is that okay if I take a moment to just talk about that? Yeah. So Blodeuwedd is a really interesting character because she is the wife of Llay, who is, as I say, presumably derived from a sun god figure. She is a woman made from flowers who is later turned into an owl. So there's all sorts of magical stuff going on around her, and she is not a mortal figure by any means. And so it is very tempting to look for an analogy of some sort of divine figure there, particularly as, you know, we do like to these days quite rightly associate spirituality with ecological concerns, and so a lot of neo-paganism is obviously about trying to find that more harmonious relationship with the non-human, and so a woman made of flowers is just sort of perfect for that. Actually, she's a good example of how some of the characters in the Mabinogion, although they look wonderfully divine, possibly aren't. There are virtually no antecedents for the character Blodeuwedd in known Welsh tradition, literature, or mythological religious stuff. And in terms of archaeological evidence, then it's pretty thin on the ground as well. There are lots of mother figures related with fertility, but this sort of the flower and the owl imagery that we get with Blodeuwedd isn't there. They tend to have other names as well. That's most commonly what we get is matrona or matrona, meaning mother, basically. There is, in some Gaulish religious symbolism from Romano-Gaulish times, there's a figure called Rosmerta who sounds a bit flowery and seems to be associated with fertility and plenty and things. So it's some people have been tempted to make a link there. But according to Miranda Oldhouse Green, in this very good survey of the archaeological evidence from late Iron Age context, Rosmerta actually seems to really mean good purveyor, whereas Blodeuwedd means face of flowers, flower face. And so for all that it's very, very tempting to go, oh, place of flowers, she's made of flowers. Or Rosmerta, that sounds a bit like Rose. There must be a connection there. It's a really good example of how, like I've said on your channel before, I think, you know, if we want to try and really unpick this stuff, really see how the stories were made, then we have to, rather than cut the cake, we have to unbake the cake, really. And the way that this cake was baked, it was quite different from the way that the name Rosmerta was formed, apparently. There is, from early Irish mythology, there's a figure called Blanat, who is whose name means little flower, and who is, while not made from flowers or anything like that, but she appears in a couple of stories where she's in a love triangle, just like Blodeuwedd ends up, between a figure associated with Lugh and Cuchulainn, in this case, the Ulster hero. And she is seen as being treacherous to her husband and things, which fits with Blodeuwedd. Yeah, there's nothing necessarily to say that she is definitely a goddess either, because this she's known from sort of the 8th century, so long after Irish paganism had sort of morphed into early medieval Christian Ireland. And it is entirely possible that Blodeuwedd was a late medieval literary influence by somebody who knew the Irish material. In fact, Patrick Sims-Williams has done a whole book on Irish influences on Welsh medieval literature, which just really, I think, in some ways, I totally get the fact that a lot of us, I feel it myself, sometimes we're kind of disappointed when we look at this stuff and we think, wouldn't it be really great if there was this fantastic example of pre-Christian mythology here? And it can feel a real letdown when you look at the evidence and go, oh God, maybe there isn't. Do we really have to be so dry and academic about the evidence? Well, you know, if we want to be honest about the matter, then yeah, we do. But actually, there's a consolation here as well, because the idea that these stories are a living thing, that were evolving in the imagination of an incredible storyteller, I think, in medieval times, to say something really profound and human about their own social and cultural context, which still stays the test of time now. I think that's really inspiring too. And so, yeah, really engaging with the idea that these, if there was stuff that was made up in medieval times, that's good too. Let's listen to the medieval imagination and see what they wanted to say.
Folklore. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I should say as well, I mean, there are other characters in there. Oh, sorry. I know I'm going on so much. But,
I'm just conscious because I've also got
you've got a lot of questions to cover.
People in the chat, we've had questions from YouTube members and patrons which I want to get through first.
Absolutely.
And then I'm tagging all your chat questions. So if we got time at the end, we can then go through the chat questions.
Okay.
I really want to get through the patron and YouTube members ones first.
Absolutely.
So the next question I had was about the landscape and how much of, or the question actually was, the stories move through recognisable Welsh places. The events and characters are fantasy, potentially. So, almost certainly, given some of the things they do, to what extent do the places reflect real territories or tribal areas or cults or centres of medieval power?
Yeah, a bit. Partially, yes. And and this is one of the wonderful things about the stories, is that they are very much written into the landscape as well, and you can actually visit several sites which feature in the stories, which I've done, and it's really, really inspiring. It's great. But in terms of tribal centres of power from the past, where these traditions might have evolved from, it's a bit tenuous, but certainly one of the things that really matters in the stories is the sort of dichotomy between the kingdom of Gwynedd in the north of Wales and the kingdom of Dyfed in the south of Wales, and those are medieval kingdoms. And so the political realities of that medieval moment were definitely foregrounded as important in the world of the stories. Some people like Will Parker, who wrote this very extensive, elaborate tome. Yeah, it's incredible. He does a lot to suggest that even within the medieval Welsh imagination, there might have been some sort of tribal culture or consciousness harking back to Roman times and before, with an idea of the north being associated with the upper world, the south with the underworld, and the south with the long indigenous cultural identity. What's that?
That's interesting, because we often find that the east beyond the East is associated with the underworld in earlier Indo-European texts. We see that in Old Norse manuscripts and Vedic literature, that the underworld is off east, just out of reach.
Right,
You're saying
right.
south could be, so that's interesting.
No, it is curious, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know, what other scholars might think of that view. I think it's an interesting idea, and he makes a reasonable case for it, but it's not a definite cast iron case. Yeah, and also he likes the idea that a lot of the sort of dynastic stuff going on between the House of Dawn, for example, the House of Llŷr, and the royal house of Dyfed, who are very important in it. The medieval upper class audience, certainly the royal houses of medieval Wales, would have felt that they were seeing characters who they might be descended from there, that within the medieval Welsh imagination there was this idea of a sort of a tribal lineage going back to before Roman times, kind of thing in there. Which is interesting, yeah, but that doesn't really map onto the individual specific places beyond the kingdoms of Dyfed, Gwynedd, and so on. A lot of the individual places. Now, I'm talking about the individual places here, but I can see, John, you're really curious about the.
In my head, and I'm quick. No, that's fine. That's fine. I'll have a beer with you and ask you about 50 other questions.
Okay. Let's do that. Yeah.
All right.
But yeah, so like specific sites that feature, like Harlech, where you can go now, as a little town with a medieval castle. It appears twice in the second branch of the Mabinogion, in association with Bendigeid Fran, the giant king of Britain, and also with the singing birds of Rhiannon, who can soothe all your ills. There is no, as far as I know, as far as I've read, there is no record of any specific centre of power there before the medieval castle was built. So it could be that the author was drawing an association with the landscape they knew there. Other features that appear are Tomen y Mur, or Mur Castell, as it's also known, which is a site just south of Snowdon, which is where Llŷr and Blodeuwedd were supposed to have been given as their marital home. There are remains there, but the remains archaeologically are now known to be a Roman legionary fort with its own amphitheatre, and a later Norman age bailey. Or motte, rather. Sorry, motte, from a motte and bailey castle. There's another site in the south which features a lot. This is Gorseth Arberth, which is a mound, which to the people in the stories of the Mabinogion is mysterious and presumably old.
Mysterious mound.
Yeah, exactly. And if you go up on top of the mound, then if a nobleman goes on top of the mound, then he will either suffer a blow or see a miracle, see a wonder. Now, apparently, the most likely candidate for the site of Gorseth Arberth is a place that's now called Camp Hill, near the town of Narberth in South Wales, which is an Iron Age mound. So there is some sort of link there, but not in such a way as we can actually map it onto anything we understand of tribal sites. So my hunch here is that what we're seeing is people who had inherited oral traditions about these characters and about these amazing stories, and who are living in a landscape which has ruins from bygone ages in it, which they do not understand. A medieval landscape, whether that's early medieval going on into the late medieval times when the stories took their final form. And they address these mysterious landscape features in their imagination by incorporating them into the stories that they are telling. You can see that happening over the border in England with places like Wansdyke, which is, I believe it's a Romano-British earthwork, but which Anglo-Saxon tradition later names Woden's Dyke, which becomes Wansdyke. places called like Grimes Graves, which were Neolithic flint mines, but which are then named after Grim, another name for Odin, or Wayland Smithy, which is a Neolithic long barrow, which is then attached to the Wayland figure Völand in Icelandic literature, a divine smith, yeah, I think it's the same process at work, really, and that's okay.
Landscape remaining relevant for the stories.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it just shows, again, it shows people using their imaginations, and it shows people, yeah, sort of dreaming, really, as a way of grappling with the unknown and with a sense of wonder.
Okay, so the story itself. So it has some interesting moments in it. So there's some violence and there's some grotesque things and mutilation, magical punishment, and the like, monstrous birth, an impossible pregnancy. So these are, well, are they simply dramatic storytelling devices, or do they preserve something that's important to the story itself?
Yeah, I think it's both, really. I mean, I do think that the stories are told incredibly dramatically. Some scholars, Andrew Breese is one of them, and Kenneth Jackson as well, I think it was, have said that they don't think the stories follow a logical order, and therefore whoever did it wasn't an experienced storyteller. I would disagree. I mean, I can see what they mean. There are some logical inconsistencies in the sequence of events in there, but in terms of how human nature is conveyed through literary action and the intensity of drama and emotion and stuff, I think it's second to none, really. And so in that sense, yeah, the gross elements, the gory bits, they do add an emotional charge to it in a big way. I mean, one of the most gory bits is when Rhiannon, her son Pryderi, has been born. She sleeps, resting from labor, and then when her handmaidens are supposed to keep awake and watch all night, but they fall asleep, and when they wake up, the baby has vanished. And so to try and avoid the blame, they say, I know, there was a dog who gave birth last night as well. Let's kill one of her puppies and rub the blood on Rhiannon's face and hands and throw the bones in her lap and say that she killed her own child, killed and ate her own child. It's horrible, you know, it's really horrible. But I think that element of the horror, it's there not just for shock factor, I think, but to give a sense of the stakes at play, really. And also we got to remember as well that this was written in a medieval context where blood and death were much more a part of daily life for most people, even for the upper class, really, as well, who would have gone hunting regularly, slaughtering animals, and who, whether or not they lived in particularly warlike times, lived in a time when they were supposed to be ready for war as well, and supposed to, you know, they were supposed to present as warriors, and so yeah, it's sort of how things were at the time. And I think it's good that translators have left it in, because it means we can understand the stories as they were meant at the time as well. But I think one of the most important elements of the stories really is the relationships between the characters. And so the horrific things that they do to each other actually are part of the emotional baggage, motivation, really, as well. You want to understand why people are doing the things they're doing to each other. Well, it's because that guy, my half brother, picked up my son by the hair and threw him on the fire, you know, and really vivid images like that. But yeah, but the reason I think this is so important is because I subscribe to a theory which kind of grew out of work by people like J.K. Bollard and Catherine McKenna, that I think I first heard it voiced by Gwilym Morris Baird, actually, which is that the four branches, at least, were intended as a sort of a lesson for young noblemen of the 12th century of how they ought to behave. But rather than a didactic lesson, It was a lesson done by just showing you characters who act nicely to each other, nice things happen. Characters who, in very understandable, relatable ways, because of hard feelings or greed or whatever, don't do well by each other, and then bad things happen. And so when it goes to the real extremes of horrible stuff happening, it is often the motivation or the consequence of how people have chosen to treat each other. And that is where a lot of the real power of the stories lies. I've seen that thing there about 10 minutes. Have I gone on for that long?
I'm
Really sorry.
I'm enjoying it.
Okay.
So I'll say, I did want to get through the main questions, then we can go freeform. And this may never end, who knows? So I'm fine with that. So in the second branch of the Mabinogion, we see Irish and Welsh relationship going on.
Yeah.
So are you aware of any Irish tales that reflect an Irish side of that happening?
Yeah, and that was a really interesting question. I thought it was really interesting because, yeah, for those who aren't aware, so the second branch largely focuses around the Bendigeidfran, the king, marrying off his sister Branwen to the King of Ireland for political gain, and then it goes sour, and then to basically rescue her, they invade Ireland and end up slaughtering everybody. Although only 7 British warriors survive as well, and it's really bad for everybody. And a lot of this revolves around a magic cauldron. And there is a slight analogy for that in the tale of Cilwch and Olwen, which is one of the rest of the Mabinogion stories, still a Welsh story, where King Arthur, this very much more sort of Welsh mythological King Arthur, leads a raid on the other world to steal a cauldron. And that too has a close parallel in some of the poetry ascribed to the figure of Taliesin from Welsh poetic tradition. There's a poem describing a raid on a place called Caer Sivi, which kind of means the fort of fairy folk in a way, I suppose. But the Sivi there is definitely a borrowing from Irish she, as in the fairy mound and the people of the she. So there's a definite sort of back and forth going on there. But in terms of an Irish story that might actually say, oh God, yeah, and then the British came over here and stole our cauldron and killed everybody. Actually, I don't know of any such story, really. Now, if there is somebody who knows more about the Irish side of things than me, might be able to correct me on that. But what I know of instead from Irish mythology is more a sense that... well, I know what I'm trying to say here. In Irish mythology, an awful lot of the time, then you get stories about islands in the West that are places of wonder, that might even be otherworldly places. So Tir na Nog, the land of the ever young, is a classic example, but also you get stories from early medieval literature about Imrama, as they're called, which is navigations or voyages, is maybe a sort of more standard English equivalent. A lot of these involve like heroes like Maldun, a hero called Bran, which is an element of Bendigeidfran, Bran, and then the Saint Brendan, heading off for the West and going to island after island after island and seeing all sorts of incredible things, and then coming home and telling people about it. Excuse me. And so there is a bit of a parallel there, because actually a lot of scholars have suggested that for the medieval British mind, or maybe even the prehistoric British mind, then Ireland was an island in the West, that although they had very practical socio-economic trade relations with and everything like we know they did from archaeology, at the same time it occupied this sort of slightly otherworldly place in the imagination. And within the second branch of the Mabinogion, Gwales, which is the name given to an island, it's believed to be off Pembrokeshire, is also treated as an island paradise as well. And so they're clearly comfortable with multiplicity and what we would see as contradiction. So there's an idea of a bit of a sort of a parallel there. and obviously the sort of divine figures recur as well. But sadly, no, we don't. So, which maybe suggests that these were stories, the Mabinogion stories, perhaps didn't have great currency in Ireland, even though, as we can see, there is an influence of Irish stories coming in the other way, really, with figures like Blodeuwedd and Blodeuwedd. Yeah.
All right. So, the next question you had was around if you study later Welsh folklore or Irish medieval literature or even Indo-European mythology, has that changed? If you're familiar with these things, would it change how you read the Mabinogion? And should we be cautious about projecting the older mythology back onto the medieval text? Because you mentioned it with, like modern, maybe calling neo-pagans maybe want to take names out of Mabinogion and think they're old gods and they're not. So is there anything you've seen in literature or that would just help you understand the Mabinogion and things you've seen that really haven't?
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, well, I certainly, when I first was drawn to the Mabinogion, then a lot of the appeal was the idea that these might be pre-Christian gods, and therefore, following the links back, and the fact that we can see these pretty close parallels between some figures and known Irish gods, like Llay is Lugh, and then Gaulish gods is also Lugh, and so. Yeah, that's really tantalizing, and given the known connections between other mythologies and sort of deeper, older Indo-European stuff, then you can sort of think, well, clearly there must be some way of establishing these links. My experience is that the clear links are pretty few and far between in the Mabinogion, actually. I think, I mean, I really like Will Parker's book. I think it's an amazing, the sheer level of detail. Yes, huge. And it covers so many different aspects of history and interpretation and things, and somehow manages to synthesize them all as well. But I think he kind of shows you in the examples that he gives of trying to draw parallels between, say, Llay and Loki is one of the ways he looks at it, and saying maybe there's some sort of common narrative going on there, and that maybe Balor, who in Irish mythology is a sort of a huge, big enemy of the gods, who has but one eye, which Lugh pierces with a sling or a spear. Maybe there's a parallel there with Balder in Norse myth, who Loki doesn't actually attack with a spear, but Loki provides the spear by which somebody else can attack Balder. So he's saying, okay, so maybe there's an analogy you can make there. The names are similar. Maybe there's some sort of oral thing going on. But at the same time, you could take that in a completely different way. And I would say, okay, so if Llay and Lugh are the sun god, then Balder is, the golden shining one in some ways. I don't know if it's actually described as gold, but everybody loves him. So that's the sort of this sort, which is the kind of figure that Lugh and Llay are themselves. They are these fair, shining, heroic figures. And like so many solar figures, and arguably even like Llay himself, Balder dies and then returns, and so in that respect, because
he doesn't return, does he?
Well, this is the thing. He does in the prophecy of Ragnarok.
Yes, okay.
Then it says that because Balder's death is one of the key events that precipitates the end of days, isn't it? So the death of the sun, and then we have the nuclear winter almost of the Fimbul winter of Ragnarok, and then after that has passed, then the prophecy is that a new land will rise, and Balder and his brother who killed him will sit down together, and so. So in that case, I would say, well, actually, Balder to me is a more convincing analog to Llay and Lugh as a sun god. And I think what I'm trying to say is really that the information we have is scant enough that you could probably draw lots of different interpretations from it.
It's whatever you want, but
Yeah,
it's probabilistic. Which is the nature of the beast when you're doing comparative mythology.
Yeah, totally. Again, you have to unbake the cake, and sadly, we don't have enough information about the process of baking the cake to really be able to do that.
So I guess the question is, what do you think is the most single misunderstood thing about the Mabinogion?
Oh God, that's a really good question. I'm sorry, I feel like such a heel, a real killjoy saying it, but actually, I think the most misunderstood thing about the Mabinogion is that it represents one single consistent corpus of pre-Christian mythology. I think there are elements of that in there, and I haven't even really scratched the surface of the elements that you could pick out in there. I mean, I haven't talked about Pryderi yet, who is another potential sun god figure in it. Yeah, I think what we need to understand about it instead is that it's the work of a really good imaginative mind. It demonstrates that these traditions were still alive and well and active within the Welsh popular culture in medieval times, and that somebody was able to do something magnificent with them that spoke to medieval times and continues to speak to us today.
Yes. Okay. What I'm going to do is I've got a few other questions, but I'll go back to the chat because I did highlight a few. We got so one question is, which is something you've touched on, is isn't Mabon also a Wiccan holiday? I'm not aware of that.
Yes, I have heard of people using Mabon to refer to the autumn equinox, actually. Yeah, Mabon actually, I think is one of the genuinely interesting figures who probably has a divine pedigree, really, I suppose. So the figure of Mabon is only mentioned briefly in the tale of Cilwch and Olwen, not in the Four Branches, and he is presented as a hero who was stolen away from his mother, between his mother and the wall, when he was but 3 nights old, and has been imprisoned ever since then, and nobody's ever seen him. And Arthur and his followers are required to go and find him, which they do because they're amazing. The name Mabon, like I said earlier, Mabinogi and all of that, it basically means son. And he is named as Mabon, the son of Modron, which basically means mother. And so he's the son of the mother. And in Romano-British, and I think Gaulish as well, inscriptions of divine figures, then we have a character called Maponus, which means, again, the son. And we have Matrona, who I mentioned earlier, which means mother. And Maponus particularly seems to have been worshipped. There's a lot of inscriptions to him around Hadrian's Wall. In a military context, he seems to have been somebody who had warlike associations. So that's a pretty clear godlike link there. And I think you could also build an argument for him for Pryderi and Rhiannon essentially being the same figures, just under different names. So there's a diversity, a multiplicity of possibly even different regional traditions going on in the Mabinogion that have been sort of squidged together into one body of story.
Really, there's probably one character that appears in the Four Branches, isn't there? Is there more than one? I think.
Who's that?
In terms of
What's that, sorry? One character?
In terms of characters that appear in all 4 branches.
Pryderi is the only one.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so that goes again with the argument that maybe Mabinogi meant it was something to do with the god Maponus, named in this case as Pryderi, and maybe there was an earlier version of the 4 branches which told, because Pryderi is born in the first branch and dies in the last branch. He doesn't have a massive part to play in every story along the way, but he's there, and so maybe there was a previous tradition in which there was a cycle of stories about his life.
Yes,
it's possible. It might not be possible as well, but
probability again. So probably a different question then, similar to that, is how Christian would you say the Mabinogion is?
That's a good one. It was written in a Christian context.
Absolutely.
So yeah, the characters do swear by a single god, a monotheistic god. I think I'm remembering right that sometimes the phrase they use is "by the god my people swear by," and so there's this kind of acknowledgement by the author that this is supposed to have happened in some distant past, which presumably wasn't a Christian past, because they know when Christianity arrived on the scene and things. But nonetheless, like there are bits that refer to bishops and curates and the like. The morality that I think the stories are articulating is one where mercy and respect are highly valued. I think. I think there often you will see characters acting quite the opposite from that. But I quite like the idea that the interpretation at the time might have been that the consequences were not good. Whereas, like the one story really that has well, no, it's not the only one that has a happy ending actually, but no, the third branch of the Mabinogi has the character Manawydan, the son of Llŷr, who might be a late Iron Age character called Mandubracios. John Koch has written a piece arguing that. He's often also associated with the Irish sea god Manannan mac Llŷr, Manawydan, son of Llŷr, Manannan, son of Llŷr. Yeah, he is constantly being criticized by the people around him for not doing the heroic macho thing that Cuchulainn would do in the earlier Irish stories, and just going out and seeking bloody vengeance for anybody who's insulted him or anything like that. And people are always saying, "You're a nobleman, stop embarrassing yourself." But in the end, by being moderate and forgiving and all this sort of thing, then he wins everything. He gets all his loved ones back and safe, and everything just the way he wants it to be. And so, in that sense, I think there is there's a definite Christian context here. I would hazard to guess that in an Iron Age context, the morality behind that story would have been very different. And in Koch's piece, where he compares him to this figure Mandubracios, then he's saying that Mandubracios was a figure of shame. And was not held up to be a virtuous role model or anything like that for not fighting. That's a bit of a simplification, but in terms of, so in that respect, I think you can't ignore that Christianity is part of the mix, really. But I don't think it's fair to say that somebody took a load of old stuff with gods in him and no, we can't do that, let's change his scribble that bit out. I don't think it worked like that, because these stories had been current in a society that had been Christian, going back to relevant,
and because they had to be relevant, you had to put names of gods in people understood, or
exactly. And also, I mean, the whole, like Margaret Murray's whole idea about the old religion having been suppressed by Christianity is kind of debunked by most historians and archaeologists these days anyway.
Absolutely.
And what we now understand is more that people in medieval times, in the gap between Roman Britain and the Mabinogion taking its form that it's currently in, then people would have been quite happily believing themselves to be Christian and enjoying those stories for what they told them about life and how they could relate to each other and things, and also enjoying traditional folk stories because that was common currency and it was fun and entertaining, and it still meant something in terms of how we should treat each other. And
kings of England were Christian, but their great grandfather was Odin.
Exactly.
Best of all worlds. That's how
I
don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but when you were talking about the Welsh Arthur and you said he didn't have Excalibur, someone asked, how does Arthur become king? Welsh Arthur become king? He doesn't have a sword. Do you know?
Question. Yeah. Well, I mean, that whole sort of sword from the stone thing, that came along later on. I think.
Yeah, that is all. Geoffrey Monmouth's got a lot to answer for, to be honest.
Or somebody later than him.
But once he romanticised it and threw in a few extra knights, and it all got a bit wonky.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, to be honest, in the story of Cuchulainn Olwen, he's already king, and the next heroic king, and so they don't need to talk about that. There's this sort of assumption, I think, that the audience already knew who he was. If we dig back earlier in medieval Welsh literature, then some of the earliest references to him, like there's in the 9th century, he turns up in a historical work, a book of annals, really, the history of the kings of, well, maybe it's not exactly year by year annals, but yeah, the history of the Britons, Historia Britonum, which is ascribed to a monk called Nennius, but I think people believe now that might have been a mistake. But whoever wrote it, anyway, the way they describe Arthur is he's a war leader, but they don't actually say that he's a king. And so there's a sort of a theory that he was more of a sort of a Roman style general, sort of public official kind of role in that understanding of things. By the time we get to the 1090s, when Cilwch and Olwen takes its form, then that has become simplified, I suppose, in a way, or updated, or whatever you want to say. He is described as a king because that is the context that his audience would have understood and enjoyed most readily, really. Leader must therefore be king. Whether or not they had any particular important tradition about how he became a king, we don't know from the sources we've got. There's every reason to suspect that they didn't, because all of that stuff comes in later with Geoffrey of Monmouth and French poets and everything.
I mean, it's like, it's good story. You don't worry about the details, just you get to the big bits of the story.
It's the exciting stuff. Witches, giants, swords. Yeah.
Exactly. So what we're talking about, we can talk about dragons briefly. I've got this question, which is, what do you think of the dragons in and I'm going to let you pronounce those. They're not, that's where it is.
Yeah.
Weirdest. So who are these dragons? Do you know the dragons?
I do. This is a really, really interesting story. So this is one of it's not in the Four Branches. It's not one of the Arthurian romance versions of it. It's these little stories in between, like the one I mentioned about Maxim Uledig, Magnus Maximus, and this other one about a supposedly historical king of Britain called Llydd, who might be the son of another king called Beli, who some people have related to the god Belenos, a Gaulish god. Others have suggested is related to the Belgi, the tribe who settled parts of southern England just before the Romans arrived. Anyway, so he's got this sort of kind of pseudo-historical, pseudo-mythological kind of pedigree to him. He's probably a divine figure himself. He's probably the same as the Llydd Llaw Eraint, who is briefly mentioned in Cilwch and Olwen. There's Llydd Silverhand, probably the same as the Irish god Nudu, Silver Arm. And he, in his time as King of Britain, then Britain is troubled with 3 great plagues, and he needs to go and ask the help of his younger brother Llefelys for advice about how to deal with this. And the middle one of the 3 great plagues is a scream that is heard from beneath the ground, or well, they later discover it's from beneath the ground, a scream that echoes all around the kingdom on the 1st of May, or May Eve, I think. And that 1st of May, which was the old festival of Beltane, or as it was called in Ireland anyway, turns up again and again and again as an important date in the Mabinogion. And it causes cattle to go barren, people to miscarry children, and make strong men feel weak and sickly, and all that sort of thing. And it is traced with Llefelys' advice. It is tracked down to being 2 dragons who are beneath the ground at the centre of the kingdom, which is named as Oxford, which is clearly wrong, but to go with it. The centre of the kingdom anyway. And they're fighting each other. And Llydd they dig them up, they let them go up into the air, fight around until they fall down because they're tired, and he's got a vat of wine with silk spread over the top of it. And by this time, as they're falling, the 2 dragons turn into 2 pigs, which land on the silk and go down into the wine and drink all the wine and fall asleep. And then he wraps them up in the silken sheet and takes them off to the most inhospitable, isolated, inaccessible, that's what I'm trying to say, part of the kingdom, and buries them. And that is in Snowdonia, and it is pretty much stated within the broader corpus of Welsh tradition that these are the same two dragons which Merlin in Geoffrey of Monmouth at least goes and reveals under the hill called Dinas Emrys, which is there. You can go to it. It's another geographical feature. And yes, like somebody said in the chat, Merlin has to fix this mess. Exactly. Yeah. So those are the dragons. And yeah, they're not quite your standard medieval dragons. They're a bit sort of, pretty much everything I've told you about them is all that we can really say. That's the only description we have.
I'm trying to think what they could be a metaphor for. But
yeah, but clearly there's something about things. The fact that they're underground at the heart of the realm. I don't know. I tell this story these days to talk about there being division and dissent and an inability to discuss stuff like grown-ups nowadays, really, and the sort of the country of Britain tearing itself apart. Maybe something similar was meant then. I don't know, but you do have this image of these two powerful beings fighting at the heart of the realm, and the screams that they emit while they're fighting are making the realm go sick. You know, all those signs of fertility gone wrong with miscarried children and cow's milk going wrong and all that sort of thing. Yeah, so there's something going on there about.
Okay.
Yeah,
interesting. So we got another question. Sherry's sword is to an anvil and a stone. It symbolizes extraction of iron and production of weapon.
Well, I mean, I've come across that idea. Yeah, so yes, it's in some versions of the story of the sword in the stone. I mean, like the way that the rhyme on the stone is written in T.H. White's Once and Future King, which is a Victorian piece of work, but again, he's playing with older traditions. Whosoever pulleth out this sword from this stone and anvil is right wise king born of all England. So yeah, you've got pulling the sword from the anvil. And Alan Garner, who's a writer and thinker who I think is amazing and I've been very influenced by, he also makes the point that going back even further to the Bronze Age, then you made a sword by melting the metal out of the stone, drawing the sword from the stone into a mold in the shape of a sword. It's a beautifully poetic idea. It's a wonderful poetic idea, and certainly it just shows how much the imagery contained in these stories resonates really deeply, and that's part of how it lasts so long. It goes beyond literal words, historical context. It keeps on saying something. For what it's worth, as I understand it, the image of the sword in the stone only appears in later stuff written in a Anglo-French context by court poets and Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was a churchman and things. There isn't any actual antecedent for that within Welsh tradition. We do have the image from the Volsunga saga from Iceland of a sword drawn from a tree, demonstrating who is the greatest champion, if not the king. Odin sticks a sword into the barnstock, which is a tree in the center of a king's hall, and only Volsung is able to draw it out because he is the greatest hero, and then it is handed down in his family line. Which, I mean, the whole idea of also, since somebody said you don't mold swords, you forge them. Yes, with iron, absolutely, you have to hammer it out. But Bronze Age technology was different. Bronze works differently. You end up with molten bronze, and you have to put it in a clay mold to get the sword. But yes, yeah. So I think what we're looking at here is storytellers who are aware of a lot of really good stories and are swapping ideas with each other, and yeah, and you know, a lot of we were talking about Indo-European analogues earlier and things. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question how much of the mythological material that we can see similarities between Scandinavian stuff, Welsh stuff, and Irish stuff, which we can, and there are more examples that I could give. how much of that was there in a pre-Christian context, and how much of that emerged in medieval times when we've got the Norse settling all around the coast of Scotland, down into the Irish Sea, Ireland, contact with Wales, even if little in the way of actual settlements, all these people just constantly swapping stories with each other and going, that's a good idea. I want to tell that again, but I'm going to do it my way. And you guys haven't heard of Finn McCool, so I'm going to make it a story about Taliesin. And yeah.
Okay, so this is a question aimed at me, I guess, from you, which is that, is there one thing you wish comparative mythologists would stop doing with the Mabinogion?
Oh, wow. Oh, that's such a good question.
So how do I annoy you, John?
No, I don't think, I've certainly never felt that you've annoyed me with what you do with the Mabinogion at all. Comparative mythologists.
So, trying to find similarities between...
Well, the first thing that occurs to me that I wish people would stop doing about the Mabinogion, and it's maybe not the same thing, but so much of the time in popular works by people who aren't Welsh, then Lleu is named as Llew, which is spelled L-E-W, not L-E-U. And that's a different word. And although it looks like Llew to an English speaker, it's not, it's Lleu. Stop getting it wrong. Oh God, yeah. What do I wish comparative mythologists wouldn't do? I wish, I know what I wish, because this does happen. This happens all the time. I wish that if people are retelling a story and dreaming about how this might be some older version of the story, some sort of maybe they've worked out what the myth was here, the actual pre-Christian version of the story, and they've respun it a bit to make it seem a bit like that. I wish they would just be honest about what they're doing and not present it as this is the old myth, because I've seen that done in books which like God, I mean,
happens all the time.
It does. I'm stumbling because I could name names, but that doesn't seem very fair.
Well, I'd honestly say I do. I often call things a reconstruction, but actually, they're, strictly speaking, they're more of an academic construction.
Well, I suppose that's fair. Yeah, but even then, calling it a reconstruction, I'm okay with that. But it's when people sort of say, "All right, here is the opening myth of," it happens like there's a whole book you can get of Anglo-Saxon myths, and it says this is Anglo-Saxon myths. Most of them are imaginative reconstructions of Norse myths, because we don't have any Anglo-Saxon myths, pretty much. Really, we have so little material. And fine, if we want to try and understand this stuff, then we have to use our imaginations and speculate and fill in the blanks with a bit of comparative mythology. And that might lead to some understanding of the possibilities, but to forget that it's just a possibility and maybe not even a probability, and to actually say, so this is the truth, this is what it is. That we're kidding ourselves, and we're misleading the public.
It depends how many books you want to sell on it, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a good question, I think, then, is what is the most archaic part of the Mabinogion, do you think?
I think there might be stuff around Lleu and Gwydion that might map onto, well, which certainly does map onto stuff to do with Lugh in Irish tradition around the Second Battle of Moytura, which is when Lugh leads the two Hade Danann, the gods, against the Fomorians, who are the sort of the chthonic underworld kind of, not really, but sort of enemies of the gods. And that, is so tempting. You can then go, oh, that's just like you get in other European mythology. Yeah, exactly. The two Titans, gods, Jotnar, Asir, Devas, Asuras in Hindu mythology. That is so tantalizing. That could be it. But I also think it is equally likely that entered into North Walian tradition in medieval times from Ireland. Now, I would then, therefore, if I was to pin my colours to the mast and say that, I would have to admit that at the same time as like Lleu here, Lugh there, we also get Lug down in Gaul and other figures who seem to fit into the same corpus. And so it would be odd for that stuff to be an actual old tradition in Ireland and to have existed in Gaul and not to have existed in at least part of Britain. So maybe there is something odd there, but I think we have to be open to both.
You speak
sides.
like a true comparative mythologist.
So if I had, so my next candidate, I guess, would probably be something to do with Rhiannon, Rigantona, the mother, and her son Pryderi, who, although it's never, because of the way the stories have been reworked and remixed in the Mabinogion, we don't quite get an exact map of this, but I think it is very likely that there was once a story where she is a goddess whose son dies or is taken away to where you go when you die, and she goes there to bring him back. And I think
that sounds familiar.
Yeah, well, quite. Yes, exactly. And I would happily relate that to some degree of Bronze Age sun symbolism, really, on the basis of comparisons with Danish archaeological finds and Alan Garner's wonderful work on the King Under the Hill at Alderley Edge and things. But even then, I'd say this is arrant speculation, really.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm conscious of time. So I guess one of the final questions is, what part of these stories do you think really represents the best of Welsh medieval literature?
Oh, wow. Gosh.
So if someone was to read it today, you'd say, read this and this will give you a real insight.
I think well, in terms of the one that I get the most out of, I would say the fourth branch, really. That's it's often comes under the name Math, son of Mathonwy, and it's the one with Llay and Blodeuwedd. It's not a happy story. It's a very complex story. It's got sexual violence in, so trigger warning there. But it's got a lot of beauty in it as well as all that ugliness. And I feel, as when I talk about how the whoever came up with the branches as they currently stand, having a really amazing grasp of the human condition and a way of exploring that through just presenting you incredibly relatable characters in fantastically magical contexts where they're turning into eagles and owls and there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on, but ultimately what drives the story is people trying to relate to each other and acting the way they feel they ought to, or they feel they have a right to, towards each other, and then finding out that it's not always easy to do it in a way where everybody comes out happy, really, and having to ask questions of themselves about what do they really want. And it's constantly I even just the other day preparing for this, then I read a piece by Brynley Roberts that made a point about the character of Gwydion, who's a magician in that story, that I'd never even considered before, about how he is punished but then forgiven, and how maybe there's a comment here on how the legal code of medieval Wales and any society needs to have a means of punishing people but then reintegrating them into society once their time has been served. And then by the end of the story, Gwydion, who is enjoying being back in a status of power, a position of power and high status, he is punishing someone who he feels has transgressed and has the opportunity to let them off, but just goes to the hilt and figuratively speaking wipes them out. And that maybe failure to learn a lesson or sense of what works for me doesn't have to work for you. And there's so much going on there.
Yes. Okay. So I guess I'll leave the sort of final words to you in terms of the story. Is there anything you would like to add about the Mabinogion? People here.
I suppose. Well, we haven't talked a lot about. We've talked a lot about the fourth branch. We've talked a bit about Culhwch and Olwen, referred a bit to Llyd and Llefelys and Max and Melody. We haven't talked about the other stories really as well. And I suppose I mean, I don't find them as engaging. I must admit they're sometimes categorized as the three romances. And there's a very interesting one called The Dream of Rhonabwy, which refers to Arthur and has this beautiful image in it of people traveling at the very beginning in a late medieval Welsh context, and stopping to spend the night in this hovel where they're like ankle deep in cow shit and things, and one of them, rather than sleep on the straw, decides, sod this, I'm going to go and sleep on that calf skin. And as he sleeps there, he has this dream, this vision where he meets King Arthur and all this crazy stuff happens. And that one, I mean, it's opaque. There's no conclusion. In fact, some people, I think it was Rachel Bromwich maybe, I think even suggest that it was intended as a satire on romantic stories and mythological literature, really, but by being deliberately obscure. And also it is believed to be the latest one of the lot, and to have probably originally been intended as a written thing rather than a spoken thing, unlike any of the rest of them.
Constructed specifically for particular job in the story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that composed as a set written text. But I'm talking about it now. I'm thinking it's poetically, it's really rich. So it's definitely worth a look at. There's lots of stuff in there about, I guess, kind of the futility of battle and of pride and how rulers ought to act and things, but you're never quite sure what's going on and who's really doing what. The three romances themselves I struggle with, but I think they are worth looking at because they're basically medieval Welsh reimaginings of stories like Sir Percival and things and things that you might be familiar with from French Arthurian, proper Arthuriana, you know, and so they're really, historically they're curios, really, and I guess that the reason I think that's interesting is because it shows this interplay of ideas, really, and that all these stories keep evolving among societies where people do talk to the guys next door and share ideas, and it's good to remember that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today, John.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to thank you everybody for letting me just rabbit on. And as you can see, this is a subject that I find incredibly easy.
Well, when it was asked for, I thought I took all of 5 seconds to think who could I recommend to be here. So do you want to tell people where they can find you? I mean, you have been known to actually present the Mabinogion as a story. A week. Yeah, I don't know if you ever fancy doing that again, or
I would love to. Yeah, that's something I will definitely do again. Yeah. So if you want to see more of what I do, then you can find my website is jonthestoryteller.com, which is nice and easy. That's just JON thestoryteller.com. And I'm Jon the Storyteller on Instagram. I am Jon Mason Stories and Music on Facebook. I do have a research profile at the University of Brighton, but I don't, because I've finished my PhD, that might not last much longer. So I would say my website is the best place to find me. But I will endeavour to keep it up to date with any gigs I'm doing, but also conference papers that I'm doing, and any sort of academic researchy type discussions into this and other questions about stories and human engagement with the imagination, really. Yeah, and archaeology and early medieval history, British prehistory, fun stuff.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for watching. If you haven't clicked like, please click like, because that will mean more people will watch the replay. Thank you for all your support, everyone. And we will, I'll speak to you all very soon, and hopefully we'll have John back on at some point in the future.
I'd love that.
Take care, everyone. Toodle pip.